Cancer touches us all. It's a disease that is meaningful, yet scary. It's a disease that causes significant morbidity and mortality, but we're making progress. Today I'll share with you how we understand cancer much better now than ever before. I'll share with you how our treatments are evolving much better now than ever before. I'll share with you how we can use our own body to fight cancer cells. And then I'll share with you the challenge that is in front of us. And that challenge is, how do we outsmart cancer? How do we defeat this disease? And I think the answer may lie in data. Let me start off by talking a little bit about the burden of cancer. In 2015, there were 17 million cancer diagnoses, 17 million around the globe. There were nearly 8 million patients who died of this disease in 2015. That was 30% more than the rates that we saw in 2005. And if we take a look at 2030, the next 15 years, those rates are going to continue to increase, but roughly double what we're seeing right now. We're going to see close to 13 million patients who will die of this disease and close to 21 million. And the reason is aging population, population growth, and some environmental factors. And if you take a look at these numbers, they are incredibly alarming. It's even more alarming when we realize that 40% of the cancer diagnoses are happening in low and middle income countries, but nearly 70% of cancer deaths happen in low and middle income countries. So the cancer that we see there is late advanced stage of presentation because of diagnostic considerations are not there, the treatment may not be there. So the burden of cancer is being felt globally, but even more so in the low and middle income countries. The key thing, of course, is that we can prevent cancer. About 30 to 40% of cancers can be prevented if we listen to these 5 factors. We exercise, we eat healthy, we watch our weight, we drink alcohol in moderation, no, don't drink, and we don't smoke. If you do those 5 things, that decreases the risk of getting cancer by about 30 to 40%. Still, there's about 1 billion people in the world who smoke. What I want to focus on today is the treatment. I want to focus on how do we understand this disease and how do we develop the right treatment for the right patient at the right time. And in order for us to be able to do that, we have to understand what is cancer. So cancer arises from a normal cell. Our DNA, the building units that drive our living cells, they get altered. And that alteration leads to a change in behavior. And that change in behavior is how cancer cells are different than normal cells. How are they different? They're more likely to grow uncontrollably. There's no sustainment in that growth. They just continue to grow. They are more likely to resist cell death. That is a normal process in our own body where there's cell turnover, but they don't die. They're more likely to invade and metastasize and go to other parts of the body, which the normal cells are not able to do. They're able to escape our own immune system, and they can hide away from our own immune system. They're able to create their own infrastructure, they create their own blood supply, bring in their own nutrients, so they continue to grow. And they're also able to mutate. And you would think, why would cancer cells want to mutate? Well, they want to mutate so that they can learn how to escape our treatments. These are incredibly smart cells which have these superpowers that we can now understand better and maybe use some of those powers as Achilles' heel as we develop our treatments. So what is in our arsenal as we take a look at how we best help our cancer patient? We have surgery, which is very good at removing the cancers that we can see. We have radiation treatment, which is using X-ray beams to be able to focus directly at the cancer cell and target these cancer cells. And we have chemotherapy, which works really well against rapidly dividing cells, such as cancer cells, but unfortunately comes with significant toxicity, as there's a lot of collateral damage that will happen as a result of chemotherapy. All the mainstays of treatment now, but things have changed. And things started to change about 2 decades ago as we started to understand what is it that's driving cancer, and that came with the era of targeted therapy. We started to understand that these are receptors on these cancer cells that become growth signals for these cancer cells to have uncontrolled growth. There are pathways within the cancer cells that drive uncontrolled growth that we are not able to stop. And so the question is, how do we target this? And we can target this by giving an antibody against these receptors. And we can target this by also giving inhibitors, small molecules that block these pathways. And you say, this is great. We know what targets cancer. We know how to approach it. This is the best way to treat cancer. The challenge is that cancer cells are smart. They say, okay, if you're going to block this receptor, if you're going to block this pathway, I'm going to circumvent it. I'm going to come up with a different pathway and develop resistance to your drug that you're offering. So we said, all right, we're going to give you multiple target pathway inhibitors. Then we start getting into toxicity. Then we said, okay, what if, we know chemotherapy works, we know there's collateral damage that happens with chemotherapy. What if you were to combine chemotherapy with an antibody in a concept called antibody-drug conjugate? What if we take the chemotherapy right to the cancer cell and use the antibody to direct this chemotherapy within the cancer cell? It was shown to be helpful in lymphoma, and we showed it was helpful in breast cancer. The challenge is that these targets that we have, in breast cancer, for instance, there's about 15 to 20% of our patients who are responsive to that kind of concept, but there's many other patients who do not respond to the targeted therapies because we're still not sure what the target is. So targeted therapy is still part and clearly what we need to do for our patients with cancer. But then we started to shift a little bit and we said, what if we use our own body's immune system? So what happens is that we have immune cells that recognize foreign cells, could be infection, could be cancer cells, and they say, you don't look right. You don't belong here. You need to be removed from here. And they target those cells. And the cancer cells are able to develop a hiding mechanism. They say, well, I'm one of you. Don't look at me. Keep moving on. And they hide away from our own immune system. And scientists started to discover this hiding mechanism to say, how are cancer cells hiding from our active immune cells, T cells that are circulating around looking for these foreign objects? And they found the reason why. They found the receptors and the proteins that make these cancer cells hide away from the immune system. And then said, why don't we attack these proteins? And that's exactly what happened around 10 years ago. We started to develop therapies called immune therapies, where suddenly the cancer cells are much more visible, and the immune cells are much more likely to be able to attract to these cancer cells, uncover them, and target them. And now, in melanoma, in kidney cancer, in lung cancer, in head and neck cancer, we use immune therapies for treatment of cancer. The challenge is that still only about 10% of our cancer patients benefit from immune therapy. In some situations, we may give the drug, but the immune system doesn't wake up. So the scientists are now looking at how do we wake up the immune system? And one of the ideas was, why don't we take the T cells from the humans which are affected by cancer, engineer these T cells to recognize cancer cells, and reinfuse these T cells back into these patients with cancer. Hence, we're able to engineer our immune system to recognize cancer. These drugs have just been approved as of this year by FDA. There's still a challenge. There's heterogeneity, there's escape mechanisms, and the question is, we may have 10, 15% of our patients who are benefiting, and this is driven by clinical trials, but that's a small subset of patients. How do we move forward if we are really going to change cancer care? And that road ahead needs us to take a look back as to where we came from. And this started to change with the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project, many of you are aware, looked at genome, which is really all this DNA that we have in our cell's nucleus. And they said, let's sequence all the DNA to know what we're all about. So from the year 1990 to 2003, there were about $2.7 billion spent to understand what is the DNA in humans. It took $2.7 billion to be able to sequence the DNA to understand what the human genome looked like. In 2005, they said, why don't we do the same for cancer so that we can catalog these genetic mutations so we can understand what's driving cancer. The challenge was cost, because we were looking at millions and millions of dollars, but thankfully, the sequencing cost started to drop down. It went from hundreds of millions of dollars in 2008, it went to $10 million, and now you can sequence your own human genome for less than $1,000. But the challenge is data. If we take a look at 33 cancer subtypes that have been sequenced so far, that data equals to 2.0 petabyte. Each petabyte is equal to about $220,000 DVDs. That's the amount of storage that is needed for understanding cancer. So the question is, maybe we don't need to sequence all the human genome. Maybe we just need to look for those mutations that we can do something about. Something called actionable mutations. Mutations where we have a drug that we can give to our patients. Mutations that we can actually act upon. That's the concept called Nextgen Sequencing. And that's what's been applied to cancer care to be able to understand that. What if we didn't have to biopsy the tumor? What if we just took a blood test and recognize cancer cells and sequence the DNA on those individual cancer cells? Concept called liquid biopsy that we're understanding and delivering now for our patients. But the challenge is data. So if we just take a look at all the labs in the world which are doing that, the amount of data that is needed in 2017 to look at those cancer cells, and this is just patients who are in clinical trials, is 1 exabyte. An exabyte is a million times a million times a million bytes. That's how much data would be needed just for us to collect the information. The question then is, what do we do with all this information? And the real answer to that is we need to have the right people on the table when we're making treatment decision making. So suddenly, the decision about what treatment we need to give to our cancer patients is not just as doctors, as nurses, as healthcare providers. We need computer scientists, we need mathematicians, we need bioinformaticians to be there alongside us to be able to take a look at this data. But that data just tells us about the cancer. It tells us about what's happening at the level of the tumor. It doesn't tell us what else is happening in those patients who did not go on clinical trials. If we have 17 million patients who are diagnosed with cancer, what if we had electronic health record data from all these hundreds of thousands and millions of patients and understand what happened to them when they received treatment? So understand how did they respond to the drugs, to understand their ethnicity, their age, their comorbidities. What if we had that data? What if we asked our patients to record their data? Something called patient-reported outcomes when they're at home, what side effect they had, what symptom they had. And what if we had a way of looking at all the knowledge that is coming in the medical literature and integrating that with the patient-level data? That is the road ahead. For us to be able to look at the tumor biology, to look at the electronic health records, to look at patient-reported outcomes, to be able to integrate and assimilate the information that's coming in the medical literature, then to be able to integrate this information and inform our patients that this is the treatment that you need to have. So the future of cancer is dependent on the advances that were made in treatment, but the future of cancer is going to be dependent on data, and the only way we can outsmart cancer is byte by byte by integrating and informing our patients based on data. Thank you very much.